Hello, and welcome to Freeplay 2019's online sessions. Freeplay is Australia's largest and longest-running independent games festival. The festival is currently running all week in Melbourne, Australia. Tickets to the weekend conference are still available, and you can find them at freeplay.net.au. If you'd like to join the conversation, our hashtag is #Freeplay19. Hello, my name is Mateja Simovic. I am a writer for Capsule Computers, an online magazine that covers film, video games, and geek culture. I'm also an organizer for Game Workers Unite Australia. Joining me today is Saleem Dabbous. Hopefully I got your last name right.
Dabbous.
Dabbous. So close.
Close.
Saleem, tell us a bit about yourselves.
Yeah. Hey, so my name is Saleem Dabbous. I'm the studio director of a game studio called CoOp, which is based in Montreal, Canada. I co-founded the studio about 7 years ago, and we recently released our first commercial game called Nog, which is a game about giant monster heads that are inspired by kids' toys like Polly Pocket and Mighty Max. We recently announced our next game called Winding Worlds, and we're working on a bunch of different stuff. And we're known for having sort of really cool visual aesthetic games that are kind of experimental.
All right. So our conversation topic for today will be cooperatives, specifically game studio cooperatives. So here in here in Australia, Game Workers Unite is particularly interested in helping to facilitate game developer cooperatives. One of our goals is to grow the industry locally, and we would like to do that in a way which is more ethical with regards to its treatment of employees and the work that they put into the organizations that they work with. And to that end, we think that cooperatives are a much more ethical and healthier model for the industry. So I'm very excited after having read about co-ops historically and in terms of the legislation here in Australia to actually talk with someone who does have experience working in a cooperative. So let's jump to our first question, Saleem. Here we go. So to start off, what gave you and your colleagues the desire to form into a cooperative? What appealed to you about a co-op structure as opposed to a regular business?
Yeah, I mean, so when we started out, we were not a co-op, and I should mention that even though our studio structure now is a co-op structure, the company isn't legally registered as a co-op yet, but that's a legal transition that we're making this year. Um, Now, that said, we've been running the company as a co-op structure since 2014. And originally, we didn't even know about what a co-op was or what the structure was like. And so the name ended up being kind of a happy coincidence because we were approaching it from like a co-op mode mentality of like we're working together. But I think that that speaks to that original inspiration is that the studio was originally meant to be kind of like a musical record label. We wanted to find really cool, interesting artists here in Montreal and collect them under one umbrella label, under one roof, and give them the resources to do whatever the hell they wanted to do, basically. Um, and just by starting off that way, while we moved away from that to find a more sustainable structure, the fact that that was our original inspiration for the company meant that we kind of always approached the structure of the studio in a bit of a different way than most traditional game companies that were popping up around us in Montreal. And I really think that record label inspiration is like was the first seed for the co-op structure. The other thing was just like I think many of us also came from non-traditional backgrounds, and most of us were not part of the game scene when we started the studio. So we didn't really have that like mentality of what a game company should be or what it should look like, and it just felt like when you bring these people on and you ask like the process of making games is really difficult as like a lot of people know, and it's a very grueling experience. It just didn't feel right that we weren't all in this together because we formed the studio to create a sustainable home for artists. It wasn't about forming a team for one project specifically and then disbanding or whatever. It was about people's people first from the very beginning. And when people in Montreal start to tell us about the co-op model, which are folks that are now part of the Game Workers Unite in Montreal, back in the day, when they told us about the co-op models, it just made a lot of sense to us. It just felt like, wow, yeah, that's exactly how we've been running this studio. We've been super transparent and open with everyone we brought on board. So why not just enshrine that into our legal structure? And like, while my co-founder and I had invested a lot of our money in the studio, at the end of the day, we didn't really care about that money being a sort of differentiator, because, like I said, we saw all the work that everybody else was doing, and it like, the fact that I had some money saved up was just my privilege and my luck that I was in that situation, and it didn't really mean anything to me. And it didn't make sense for that to be something that I could hold over other people. And so, yeah, I really do think it's like that, like, record label inspiration meant that we started the studio not with a game project in mind, but with a people's approach for shaking up what we think a video game company could be.
Yeah, it sounds like you had if not in name, at least by nature, you were certainly following a co-op sort of mentality. So from what I read here in Australia and pretty much everything online, the whole sort of governing ethos of a cooperative is quite different to that of a regular business. So as opposed to trying to create as much sort of, I guess, money and capital for the top sort of investors, and keep the business going that way, a cooperative is there to basically provide employment and an income for its members. And yeah, it sounds like you guys were pretty much falling into it just through the nature of who you are as people. So yeah, I'm glad that you've finally transitioned to properly having it as your binding ethos.
Yeah, totally. And just to point out, like, I think something that you made me think of is the fact that, like, my friend says this a lot, is that when companies start, they, like, startups, they tend to look like co-ops. Like, co-ops and startups look the same when they start, because you're a couple of people, you're all wearing many hats, you all have a bunch of responsibilities, and you're all sort of taking on this almost ownership role, even if you're not the founder, and this emotional toll that it takes on you, and this emotional burden. And so the real difference comes when those companies start to grow, is how they grow and who ends up profiting from that growth. And with our studio being the structure that it is, we specifically have a hard cap on growth, so that our goal isn't just to constantly make more and more money. Our goal is to take care of the people who work here, because at the end of the day, the company exists for us to be able to live our lives, to make the art that we want to make, and to take care of ourselves.
I remember I was having a discussion in this vein with someone who was a bit skeptical about the sort of idea of cooperatives, and there was something in the news about there was a co-op that collapsed after being in business for 5 years, and they were basically saying, this is proof that they can't work. And I'm just like, well, no, like, it succeeded for 5 years. It kept people out of the cold for 5 years. It gave them an income and supported their families and their lives. That was 5 years that these people were succeeding. But yeah, no, I think that sort of mentality of wanting to look after your members, your workers, the people working together on a project is there not to sort of consume your lives, but to rather sustain yours. And yeah, I think that's absolutely the sort of correct mentality that we should have in a lot more areas of life. I've realized that we should probably actually talk about the difference in the co-op structure and that to a regular business. So with cooperatives, the idea is generally that, as you say, like, people wear sort of many hats and are more involved in other aspects of the business rather than just the one that they're sort of specialized for. So the governing idea is that everyone has a say in the business. So when it comes to big business decisions, everyone who works there, not just the founder or the investor, the person who invested the most capital, they all have an equal say and have a voice in how or where the cooperative goes, which is compared to a business where, as I was talking to Saleem before, I've worked in the private sector, not in games, for almost a decade now. And it's essentially quite dictatorial. The boss says jump, and you say how high and in what pants. And so, yeah, there's a difference between a boss having power over you and you having an equal say as your colleagues in what gets produced and what gets done. And yeah, that would be, I guess, the quick and dirty. Would you have anything else you'd like to add, Saleem?
I think that covers it. I think it really, in the kind of co-ops that we're talking about, that workers co-ops, it means that we all equally own the company together, regardless of financial investment. So I have one share in my company and one vote, and so does everybody else who works there who chooses to become an owner after like for example, for us, we have a 6 to 12 month probationary period for new employees before they can become owners. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers the base definition.
Yeah. And that's pretty much the governing principle for like the legislative framework in Australia as well. So pretty much when you're forming a cooperative, if you're interested in forming your own cooperative, there are going to be different members who bring different things to the table. Some will be able to bring more capital, and some will not be able to bring as much. Also, just to double check, I'm getting a bit of feedback on myself from the sound. Can you guys still hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, cool. Cool. Then must be just a bit of problem on my end. So in Australia, the governing idea of a co-op is that every member gets one vote. But because to reflect the fact that there are members who invest more financially, at least, and to ensure that their sort of investment is protected, they can get non-voting shares. So the co-op can buy those shares back at a later point when it has more money, or when things end up having to be wrapped up. Assets can be divided in accordance with the shares, and the people who invested more can still get some of their money back. But yeah, sorry, that was just a little digression. I need to show what I've learned. But yeah, so let's get back to co-op and Saleem's experience. So how has the transition been? Have you noticed any changes in your relationships with your colleagues, or is everything about the same?
Honestly, everything's about the same for when we did the transition because we had been kind of operating under that structure more or less. The real difference is, I think, when it came to hiring people to join the studio, because when we first started, we were originally 4 people, or 3 full-time and 1 part-time, and now we're 10 people who are all full-time. Um, and the main challenge is kind of getting new people on board to kind of understand the structure and believe that that's the case, that they do have a voice, that they do have the right to disagree with someone who's been there for like longer than them, that it's okay if they think that we should do something differently, or to question why we're doing things the way they are, because inevitably, no matter what structure you have, some subconscious hierarchies do become, they just happen, right? There's social hierarchies, there's bias, there's a bunch of stuff that goes on, and so a lot of it is just fighting against the sort of social conditioning that people have, that in this capitalist system that we've been raised in, we have had our imaginations sort of stripped away from us for alternative forms of how to treat capital and how to structure a studio or how to structure a business. So it's oftentimes just working against people's like long-term beliefs when they join the company. So I'd say that's been the biggest friction point, really, is helping new folks understand that their voice is heard and they have the right to stand up for themselves and to disagree, no matter how junior they might be, and also to kind of reformulate what they expect out of the studio and what the studio is there for, and how they can take advantage of it for their own work.
Yeah. So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about with regards to that, in fact, is the sort of need for cooperatives, because you've got a transparent structure and people need to not just be, I mean, you can absolutely be a passive member where all you do is you come in, you do your 9 to 5 and you leave. But for a co-op to sort of function as best as possible, it'd be great if you could invest in it and be a more active member, which includes, having your say when it comes to sort of decisions that the co-op wants to make collectively. So with regards to that, like co-ops, from what I can tell, require a lot of sort of communication from their members and to each other. How do you account for, perhaps varying communication styles or the different sort of communication capabilities of different members? Do you guys allow for any sort of consideration to those sorts of differences in capability, or?
Yeah, that's a really great question because I think it's something that personally think about a lot, especially in terms of thinking about things like gender dynamics, and the different expectations people have with juniors and seniors and things like that. And so, something that I try to do is we have team meetings about the business every month or so. Sometimes it's a bit more frequent if we have a lot of stuff that needs to be discussed, and sometimes it kind of slips to being less frequent when there's nothing really major to discuss. But what I do is have one-on-one meetings with every staff member every 2 weeks, and that's just to gauge kind of like how things are going with their work, because I act as the producer on all of our projects, so it's like a one-on-one producer check-in. But we also take that as an opportunity to discuss things that are just part of the business, maybe things like, if I notice someone was kind of quiet at the last meeting or whatever, I'll just like, kind of make sure that they're being heard, or if they have anything that they want to bring up in confidence first before we present it to the whole studio. It's really, honestly, a lot of my learnings over the year, a lot of the things that I've had to learn is just an element of emotional labor in managing teams, and just being very conscious of my own biases, my own kind of the things that I would mess up essentially, and try to catch myself, and constantly in our one-on-ones check in. Did I speak over anybody? Did anyone do anything wrong? Is there something that you want to discuss with me first before we bring it up with everybody? Because I think it's just a lot easier to, talk to one person before you talk to 10 people. And I think just making the space available for that, as well as having, spaces like Slack, where those conversations can happen. We all sit in one big giant room, except for two of our members who are remote. So even so, most of our conversations happen on Slack, so that we have a traceable record of all of our conversations, so that people can catch up, or there's a reference to what we talk about. And so communication styles are different between team members, and I definitely notice some people are quieter, and it's a matter of just making sure that they're heard, and like doing the extra work that you wouldn't expect you might have to do to seek out those conversations. But honestly, I think if you're working in a team, you need to learn how to do that kind of communication anyways, to make sure that everybody is doing what they need to do, and that they're feeling okay, and they're well, and they have all that they need, and all the support that they need from the studio structure or from the other team members to be doing the work that they want to make.
Yeah. Yeah, from what I can tell from reading about these sorts of structures and the experiences therein, yeah, there's basically, you need people to put in the effort to make sure everyone's like having a say, and feel like it's one thing to say, we had this meeting, you could have said something, Sure, they had the opportunity to, but they didn't take it for whatever reason. And it's another thing to actually get proper input from someone who feels comfortable to voice their concerns and how they feel about any particular issue. So yeah, it sounds like you're putting in the hard yards, and I think that bodes well for co-op. So the next question: what sort of structure or structures do you have within the co-op? Since you mentioned some informal ones before.
Yeah, what do you mean by structures exactly?
So you mentioned that you were a producer, right?
Hmm.
That implies a certain degree of sort of authority. So, for instance, similarly, I've heard of other co-ops having like artistic directors that,
Right.
like, they themselves like not direct, elect. So, we've decided to invest this person with this authority. They will, you know, when it comes to sort of big decisions or whatever, we will all discuss it and reach a consensus. But if we're, at loggerheads and we need someone to sort of cut through it all, this person we've invested with this authority. Do you have any of those sort of structures or anything like that in your?
Yeah, I'd say I definitely think we do. Sometimes it's more formal, sometimes it's less formal. So I act as the producer on our projects, and I basically handle the business side of things. So people do trust me to kind of take lead on those sorts of things, and they also trust me when to come to the whole team and have discussions about things, or when I can just make like quick decisions on my own. I think for efficiency's sake, everybody is kind of trusted in their own discipline to make decisions on their own, and everyone's trusted to to sort of know when that decision needs to be kicked up the chain. So whenever there's anything involving large amounts of money, that's always something that I will discuss with everybody, and we'll discuss together as a team what the right thing to do there is. And I'll be like, here's what I think, but it's a vote at the end of the day. But in terms of projects, basically the way we're structured is anyone can pitch a project in the company. And if so, how we do it is a person will go off and work on a prototype or a pitch document or whatever they think they need to do for a couple of weeks, like 2 weeks to a month, and then they'll present that to the studio. And people will vote if we should go forward with it. And usually it's like pretty easy, like, yes, we should explore this further or not. And then it's about forming a team around that. And generally how we do it is the person who came up with the pitch or the concept is, if they're acting as the creative director for the project, then the creative director has that final say. But that final say is also considered alongside production. So I, as the producer, oftentimes will have to have that discussion of like, you have the final call on this, but this is going to be the impact it's going to have on our production schedule and on our budget. And I don't think we can do it. If we need the money to do this and we don't have the money, we simply can't do it. And that's never come to a major disagreement. I think the team is very production minded, and so whenever we have a major disagreement like that, it's always like the decision making is always very clear and is almost always reached with consensus. But we do treat the person who's acting as creative director as like the person who has final call on decisions. But it also, because each project is formed, the teams can kind of like, depending on like the projects. We're working on 3 games right now, which is a lot. But that means that people's availabilities and team composition changes from project to project depending on who's available and who's not, which project is funded versus which project is not. So the structure changes from time to time. And right now we have a team, our largest team is working on our unannounced game that we're just going by like the project name of like Team Fang. That one is our game where we're doing heavy narrative for the very first time. And we're learning for the first time how to do decision making where we have an art director and a narrative director, and those things influence each other, but who gets the final call? How does the creative director kind of like fit into all of that? And how do I as a producer fit into all of that and make sure that everybody is being heard and respected? And it kind of just goes back to, I think, communication. Like, we do have formal structures, but at the end of the day, it's more important to me that everyone feels good and like that we're making the right decisions together in a holistic way than just being like, well, the creative director said this is what we're doing, so that's what we're doing. It's like, no, let's talk about this. This is why our creative director is saying this, but like, let's kind of unpack how you feel about this, and if there's another way we can make you feel good about this decision potentially. And when I say creative director, art director, honestly, everyone's doing everything. So it's like those roles are not I am a creative director and that's all that I do. Like, for example, Kyle, who's the creative director on this project, is also an artist and an animator and a background artist and a game designer. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into it, but we do kind of come up with formal job titles for everybody, because we found in the times that we didn't do that, people weren't sure about what their sort of authority and domain was and didn't know if they were stepping on people's toes or not. So we started to come up with giving people proper titles on each project so that there was a bit more of a clarity over who has final say on what.
It sounds like you have a wonderfully formalized and crystallized, yet simultaneously quite fluid structure.
Yes, I agree. It does feel like there's a structure sometimes, and at other times it feels like we're completely winging it. And I kind of love that because it means that we're constantly changing. And honestly, we didn't come from games or production or whatever, so we're just learning as we go and constantly iterating on our own internal structures.
Yeah, no, it's good that you're able to sort of work with a structure like that. I know that some people find like quite a bit of comfort in having a clearly delineated role. So, this is my job, and this is what I do. I think I also have a preference for that when I start at some place new. I want to know exactly what it is that I'm doing and just stick to that. And when I get the hang of it, yeah, let me have more of a say in this aspect, or here are my suggestions for what you can do better to on your end to make my own job easier and maybe make things more efficient in general.
Yeah, totally. And I do think one of the mistakes that we've made over the years is throwing people into the deep end without enough preparation and lead into that.
Sorry, I live under a flight path, and so occasionally you will get the sounds of airplanes and helicopters flying overhead. Um, but yeah, no, I think that that's sort of should be part of like an onboarding process. So, explaining, you've been hired, you're going to be working in this area. We also have these sort of expectations about like your finding where you can fit in with these other projects when you can, or when you're feeling more comfortable. And I think a lot of that, like, similar to like how you have these sorts of fluid structures, a lot of it comes down to trust. And you need to sort of build that over time, and make people feel comfortable to work there, and to trust when you're explaining quite patiently, we can't do this project because we just don't have the resources at the moment. And yeah, they can sort of take that not as gospel, but understand that, yeah, this is why, and hopefully they see the sort of reasoning behind it. And yeah, I think that's another aspect of co-ops which I quite like, because unfortunately, like, reaching consensus takes time, but once you've reached consensus and everyone's on the same page and everyone understands, it's a lot more, you feel a lot more involved in your sort of business than if you're working in a sort of regular corporate structure where your manager gets their marching orders from their manager, who gives them their marching orders, and it eventually comes down to you, and you have no idea why you're being told to do this. You just know that you have to. So yeah, it's one of the reasons why GW thinks co-ops are pretty nifty. So yeah, like let's get a bit more into the sort of nitty gritty of that sort of decision making. So how are those sort of big decisions made in the running of the business? And I guess as well, how are technical project decisions made? Do you guys put it to a vote? Do you have a debate? Fight to the death? How does it work?
Honestly, decision making has been overall super easy because we have a team meeting and we just get everyone in a room. We run through the big decisions, and if there's any information people need before they can make that kind of decision that can't be presented in just like a team meeting, we'll provide the documents or whatever on Slack first, so that people can like kind of prepare themselves, and everyone's expected to kind of have some time to like bring any questions that they might have to the table. um, and yeah, we just talk it out. People ask questions, we discuss, and then in almost every situation we've had, everyone's been like, yeah, that sounds like the right thing to do. Let's try it out and see what happens, and then we just kind of take it from there. That's really been for running the business. That's really been the main methodology, is really just discussion, and then like casual debate, but it's almost always like everyone agrees on the choice because there's not that many options, and I feel like we're a team that like gels really well together, so we kind of reach the same conclusions most of the time. One of the big things that we are having to decide for one of our projects is what publisher to go with, if we want to go with a publisher. And so I'm really interested in seeing how that decision plays out, and how we make that decision as a team, because we've never been in a situation before where we had multiple people interested in being a publisher or a funder for a project. So yeah, ask me again in a couple of months, and I'll have a different answer. Maybe we do fight to the death in the end.
Uh,
um,
yeah.
but yeah, does that answer the question?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Consensus is sort of the big thing that like most co-ops seem to go for. So basically, talking until all the talking is done. Everyone sort of has gotten their point of view across and addressing people's concerns and why it is that they think that a particular option is better than another one. So for whatever reason, the only example I can think of is 12 Angry Men. But yeah, a lot less, trauma and
Mhm.
jury room politics,
Yeah.
and a lot more people trying to sort of make the best decision for themselves and their colleagues.
Yeah, and when there are times where there's just like one or two people who really have a different perspective or don't agree, then we fall back to a majority vote. But I'd say it's very rare that we don't reach consensus. But honestly, I also think that like on a day to day, I think a big part of it is because when we go for hiring, we really are looking for people who have an ideological fit with the company's like structure and like what we're trying to do with the company. So when you end up hiring people, they end up kind of being in the right mindset eventually for those sorts of decision making processes, and it makes, when you're only 10 people, it's not the hardest thing in the world. And that's kind of partly why we don't want to grow beyond a certain point, because I'm not sure it would be easy to preserve that kind of consensus and that ease of decision making if we were 30 or 40 or 50 people in the co-op. But that's just my inexperience. I know it can be done.
Like, yeah, it's just a factor of time, um,
Mhm.
and trust, basically. And yeah, building up a sort of a culture that can facilitate that,
Mhm.
which occasionally means that yeah, you just go through teething issues where people coming from one mindset, one sort of workplace culture have to learn that congratulations, like, you know, your colleague may have an idea and you can absolutely tell them that you know, you think it's wrong, but you have to take the time to explain why. Otherwise, it's, you know, it's not quite a useful opinion.
Yeah, and I think everyone kind of has to check themselves. And like I constantly, I also live in this society that like really pushes a specific ideology, and I constantly have to catch myself and in ways where I'm not acting in accordance to our stated goals. For example, where I maybe like disagreed with someone for some reason, being like, you know, oh, I don't think you're right about this because I've been here longer or whatever. I really have to make sure. I think everyone at the studio has to make sure that they are checking themselves constantly towards providing this kind of space.
Yeah, and that like does take like time and energy and effort.
Hmm.
But I think that ultimately, yeah, it's worth it. Like creating an organization and a sort of a business and structure, which ultimately is a lot less sort of alienating, I think is pretty fucking great. Um, and yeah, I think it's something that I'd love to see more of in the rest of the world as well. But you know, first we corporatize the games industry, then everywhere else. Uh, all right. So yeah, you've mentioned before that you know, you've got your creative sort of leads. How are other sort of technical project decisions made? So, for instance, like if there are multiple artists working on one project, and there's the question about like how do we want to like pursue the sort of creative style or whatever? Do they get together themselves and sort of autonomously decide like this is what we want to pursue? Or is every member sort of called in and asked to sort of provide input on what they feel a particular project should go along with?
Yeah, the way the studio is kind of played out in deciding those things is that our creative directors are essentially also our art directors. Like every project that's been greenlit as a full production has come from an artist designer. So they also tend to make the decision making when it comes to the art direction. And the way it kind of works is that people like the artist, because usually each project has only one artist, occasionally two artists. The artists will work. The lead artist will work on something, and then they'll discuss it with uh, the second artist, and that second artist might give them feedback. But it's kind of established early on that like this is the style that we're going with because that's the style that we greenlit, and that's honestly the style that we all got excited about in the first place. And then they post it into the for the rest of the team, not the company. So each team kind of like is siloed into their own chat work, like their own Slack channels, right? And then the team will like maybe give feedback about it, and then the artist can decide whether or not they want to incorporate that feedback.
Mm.
So sometimes, you know, like for example, Lucy will come up with a fantastic character design, and someone might be like, "Oh, you know, what if you tried this different like clothing option or whatever?" And then Lucy decides, does she like that idea or not? And if she does, she'll try it. And if not, she'll just be like, no, I think I'm going to keep it this way. And it's just like kind of like a thing you get used to is like people throw a lot of ideas. I work really closely with Sam on the design of our game, but he's the lead designer. I throw a bunch of ideas that he's like, absolutely not. And I'm like, sometimes I'll fight him on it. I'll argue. I'll be like, look, this is why I think this design is good or clever or makes sense. And we'll have a debate. And sometimes that'll change his mind. And other times he's like, no. And I'm like, okay, I get it. You know what? I understand that you are the lead here and the designer, and I'm not. It's just like we've established that kind of relationship over the years that it still hurts my feelings sometimes, but I think everybody needs to leave their egos at the door, and it's a learning process of how to do that as a team and feel respected and taken care of while still having healthy discussion. And it's just about like kind of being like, you know what, at the end of the day, the project is the project, and the decision for why we're not going to do something or why we are going to do something is always traced back to some sort of pillar from the design of the game or the art direction or something. So yeah, I think it's a collaborative effort that has clear chains of commands where decisions get made.
Yeah, so that's something similar to what I've heard or read about. So there are sort of like creative cooperatives that come together for like theater productions and things like that. And during the production, you know, they will have occasionally like come up to you know, the limitations of reality, as they like to call them, where it's like, yeah, we had this really awesome idea, but we just don't have the technical or like financial capabilities to follow through on this otherwise awesome idea. So how are we gonna, you know, resolve this? Um, and yeah, a lot of it is like when it comes to something like that, where they have to like start a bit from scratch. They all sort of come together and collectively are like, right, what are some ideas that are cool, that are a bit more sort of like viable for us to do? And I think like one of the things that they establish early on, like at the start, is, you know, these are our sort of principles and our governing ideas, and this is what we want to get out of this production or this project. This is what we want to get across. This is what our goal is. Um, and yeah, it's just I think it's quite good to be able to sort of have something like that and refer to it and say, you know, this is what, you know, we'd like this project to be, and this stuff might not be sort of fitting in as well as we thought it would. So let's go back to the drawing board and see how we approach it. But yeah, once again, like also that requires trust as well in sort of your leads and your directors to be like, right, you know, you see that there's something wrong with this, and you've explained as best to me as possible why, and it does sort of hurt my pride that it's being knocked back so thoroughly, but you know, I respect and trust you, and I know that you respect and trust me. And yeah, that takes a lot of time and effort to build up.
Yeah, it's definitely easier said than done, and I don't think it's always been as clean as I kind of describe it.
Mm,
I feel like it's really we've gotten to that point.
mm,
It's not something that we started with.
yeah. I guess so. The final question that I've got written down here goes into this vein, actually. What systems or procedures do you have for dispute resolution? Um,
That's a good question that I don't have the greatest answer to because we've never really had really like a huge dispute. But what it has come down to in the cases that I can think of is starting with those one-on-ones and really like kind of act as a producer. I also act as mediator for disputes,
mm,
and if there's a dispute with me, then I try to see who is willing to kind of act as mediator
mm,
for me and whoever I might have a dispute with. So like I'll solicit like people to kind of take on that role
yeah,
for that situation. But in general, it's really about having one-on-ones and understanding everybody's issue, and then deciding how to best resolve it from there. And oftentimes, it's about a person has an issue that's kind of external to the dispute, and it's like we just need to find a solution for that. But if
yeah,
it really is internal to the dispute, then it's about like really just understanding both sides and then putting the people together to talk it out with a mediator acting with a person acting as a mediator to make sure that it stays on track and that it reaches some sort of resolution. But at the end of the day, I think it really just comes back down to having the emotional labor and the emotional intelligence, rather, to handle dispute and to kind of like walk people through the process and then be like, okay, you know what? At the end of the day, we've learned something from this dispute, and like these two people should maybe not work together in this kind of capacity. And that's something that we've learned, and we'll make sure that like both of them are being met with their needs in a way that doesn't put them at odds with each other. Uh,
yeah,
does that make sense?
yeah.
Uh,
It's quite mature in terms of how I've seen. dispute and reconciliation sort of handled in a lot of sort of areas that I've been involved with. A lot of the times, with my own experience, a lot of disputes can just be resolved by asking one party, both parties, what do you think the other person thinks? And then getting them to realize, well, actually, no, this is their perspective. But occasionally, yeah, there is the sort of there's the clash of personalities which really can't be reconciled.
Yeah.
Which is quite unfortunate. But it happens, and just because two people or however many people rub each other the wrong way, it doesn't mean that they're bad employees or bad people. It's just sometimes communication styles just sort of clash or get on each other's nerves.
Yeah, and I think it's really on everyone to be mature and adult enough to recognize those. And sometimes it just takes like talking with me to like kind of unpack that and recognize that that's what's going on, and then we just kind of deal with it because at the end of the day, we are all adult and we all care about each other and want to make sure that everyone is kind of feels good about their work. Um, yeah, and like honestly, it's kind of shocking to me how almost every single dispute comes from a place of bottling up the issue and not talking about it. Because as soon as it's talked out loud, either in a one-on-one or by putting people together, it has resolved itself.
Yeah.
And I think it's just like people are often afraid to really confront their feelings with each other. And it's about maybe finding ways and spaces where they can feel safe to do so.
Mm.
And that's, I think, kind of like the next step for us as a team that grows is finding better ways to handle that.
Yeah. And yeah, it's honestly, like, I'm glad that um, you guys have definitely sort of like approached that in that way. A lot of the times with businesses, they sort of don't quite account for that in terms of their sort of structure or anything like that. They try and solve it by reinforcing the hierarchy.
Hmm.
Your boss tells you what to do, and even if you hate each other's guts, whatever, like keep working.
Yeah, we don't
Um,
have that to fall back on.
yeah, no. So you need to sort of resolve these things, and yeah, like just from my own personal experience, like a lot of the time, it's just it's never like lightning out of nowhere. There's always a build up, and it, I guess the trick is like finding a release and also seeing if there's a way to sort of ameliorate that build up or try and have these things resolved before they become an issue. And
Yeah,
for that, yeah, sorry.
yeah, constant team communication, specifically to like bring up those issues, I think is the best resolution we've found for it.
Mm, yeah, it's uh, it's the wonders of active communication.
Yeah, and you know what else actually? It's kind of like that bullshit that you hear about when you watch shows or whatever about like, or if you work in a very corporate environment, like those team bonding
Mm,
experiences. But actually, team bonding is amazing, and doing those sorts of things really does help promote trust and care and kindness with each other. We also started doing workshops with external mediators for things like anti-oppression, anti-racism, and team building exercises. And we found that those really do amazing for bringing people together to discuss really difficult subjects, which makes them kind of take care of each other better.
mm. Yeah, I'm really glad that co-op doesn't shy away from like the politics of their own individual members and the society that they're living in. And I think that's particularly healthy and honestly a very good way to sort of approach the problems that we're sort of facing on a structural level. Um, but yeah, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share in our last minute together before we open it up to questions?
I think that the one thing I would like to share with people is to really reframe their relationship to money, because I think that that is at the root of a lot of our problems in society. And it's like to really look at the structures that give us the privilege and the luck to have more money than somebody else, and to really ask ourselves, like, does that really matter? And is there a way that I can find a fair way to work with someone and put aside the money equation? Because I think that that's really like the root of our co-op structure, is that the money equation is not part of the hierarchy, and I think that that really takes reframing your relationship to money in our society to get to that point. So I think people should really kind of look inwards towards that.
Mm. All right, so we've got our first question from chat. How do you foster such a positive and supportive studio culture? Is it purely being selective about people you hire, or is there a level of learning and an onboarding that takes place once people come on?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've kind of touched on that throughout, but I definitely think it's a combination of both of those things. I think co-op has not always had a positive studio culture, particularly in the year before shipping Nog, where we were just like all kind of miserable and not friendly with each other, and like just like under so much stress and anxiety that we were like really creating a toxic environment. And I think it's honestly a testament to the team that we were able to pull through together and stay a team, where like nobody left from that after shipping Nog, which was really like, I think, very lucky. And we have done a lot of work to make sure that we never hit those sorts of lows ever again. Um, when it comes to hiring, we are extremely selective. I actually find hiring super, super, super difficult because it's very few and far in between that we find somebody who really fits the vibe that we're going for. And part of that is that you never know how it's going to go with somebody until you actually work with them. So we do two things. One is that we have a probationary period where a person cannot become a co-op member until they have worked a certain amount of hours, which is across months and months. The other is that whenever we have some extra money, we try to give it to somebody to kind of make a project that is their own, and we run it out of our studio and we help them out. We give them like resources, and they can do whatever they want with the game. They can release it for free. They can charge for it. Doesn't matter. But by going through that process with us, we end up working very closely, and we have a very good idea if this is somebody that we would maybe want to hire eventually or not. So it's really about establishing a long-term relationship with the people that we want to bring on as co-op members, um, on top of the onboarding and the training and the adjustment that goes on with bringing people in.
Yeah, it sounds a bit similar to what sort of big companies do with sponsoring like technical colleges and things like that.
Mhm.
And I think when it comes to sort of a cooperative structure, giving people a taste of that is, yeah, it's definitely a worthwhile sort of pursuit. And like, I'm glad that you guys are comfortable enough with your money that you're willing to sort of put that out there to actually give people a chance to pursue their projects and see what working in a cooperative environment would what it would be like for them and whether it's something that they'd like to pursue. And I think it's a lot better than, yeah, throwing someone into the deep end and it's like, congratulations, we're all making decisions together. What's your
Yeah.
opinion?
Yeah, and I mean, we still do that to some degree, but I can definitely see how that is very stressful and anxiety inducing, and unfair in a lot of situations.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. And I think a lot of that does require like, uh, I think there is definitely a lot to be said for like, teaching someone sort of a proper studio culture and explaining like, yeah, this is how we do things here. Uh,
Yeah, and I think part of that is also that we've just been around for 7 years now. So we've grown into these more mature people that have this sort of emotional intelligence and understanding. Because when we started the studio, we were all in our early to mid 20s, and now we're all in our early 30s. So when we bring on new people who are younger, it's like they get to benefit from a lot of that learning that we've made, so that we're like, oh my god, I don't ever want you to go through what I went through when we were shipping Nog. I want to make sure that nobody ever experiences that again. And so there's like a nice way of like kind of as older sort of people who've gone through it, that we can give back to our younger team members just through the learnings that we've experienced, and just becoming, like, instead of being, a studio that is operating out of a basement or a bedroom or whatever, we're like actually treating it like a real company, which is something we used to avoid when we were younger, because that felt uncool or whatever, or not indie or whatever. But now we're like, oh, actually, there's a lot of learnings we can pull from those environments that are actually about maintaining and preserving people's attitudes and health, and creating safe, caring environments for them to do amazing creative work.
Okay. Yeah. And yeah, as we sort of mentioned before, like that takes a lot of time and energy, basically. But yeah, from what I can tell, it's pretty worthwhile. From what I've read, like having that sort of environment to work in seems good on paper, and from what you've told me, it sounds pretty good in reality too. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely worthwhile to pursue. Um, yeah, I don't know if we've got any more questions, so I'll just jump over to Twitter and see if anyone's hashtagged us. No, doesn't look like it. So I guess yeah. Any last sort of thoughts in our last 4 minutes together, or any shout outs or projects you wanna share with us?
I'll just do a shout out for my team. Honestly, I love everyone that I get to work with. I'm really grateful for the trust that they place in me, and vice versa. And I think that it's only been possible because of the co-op structure. And so I feel very, very lucky and privileged to be able to do what I do, and work with the people that I get to work with.
No, that's really awesome. I will shout out a couple of things. So tomorrow at Freeplay, Game Workers Unite will be organizing a small business workshop. We will have a representative there from New South Wales CoOps to talk about co-op structures. If you're interested in starting your own cooperative, or getting on the road to starting your own cooperative, feel free to come along. If you're watching this and you're inspired and want to start your own co-op, but don't know how to get started, feel free to get in contact with Game Workers Unite Australia, and we'll point you in the right place, in the right direction. So yeah, thanks so much, Saleem. Just gonna do one last double check for any questions. Nope. Okay, cool.
Thank
Yeah,
you too for moderating this.
I was thrown into the deep end, and I think I did okay.
Well, it was a blast talking.
No
And
worries.
thanks everyone who came to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all to our very quiet audience. And yeah, I think we're pretty much done and wrapped up, done and dusted. So yeah, I guess at this point, I don't know. What is there any sort of final thoughts we should share or anything in our last few minutes together?
Well, I'm ready for bedtime, so that's gonna be my sign off.
All right. Well, in that case, Saleem, we wish you the sweetest of dreams, and wish you the best of luck. All right.
Awesome. Thanks.
Cool.
Bye.
Say bye and end it.